Abbey Research Reads, folks. Dr. Erin here, popping in with another book review. You might have forgotten what my face looked like, even though it's on the shared graphics with Dr. Kristen. But from time to time, I do get a book read here and all the other work I do at Abbey Research. And this one particularly goes back a little bit towards our Colonizers World Tour coverage in April of this year when we did a full month on Brazil, and Dr. Kristen already has some great books up all across Abbey Research Reads talking about what we've learned about Brazil. But I am coming to you today to talk about Michael Reid's epic tome, Brazil, The Troubled Rise of a Global Power. And I say epic tome because it took me 6 months to read it, y'all. This was my Everest, but I have climbed Everest, and I am delighted to report to you that this Everest was very much worth the climb. Michael Reid is a journalist and an academic who has been living in Brazil for a very long time and painstakingly details aspects of Brazilian culture, politics, society, history, and how it helps us understand where Brazil is today. It is worth stating from the get that this book was published before the election of and the dramatic changes brought to Brazil by President Bolsonaro. It does portend some of those changes and shifts in political ideology. There's a great line in here. He says where Brazil is actually has an allergy to liberalism, which is hilarious in and of itself. But the book was published in 2016, so it goes all the way up to just the start of the Operation Car Wash scandal, the Petrobras scandal that eventually brought down Dilma Rousseff's presidency, and the whole scandal with Lula as well. If you would like to know more about this, without necessarily reading this book, we covered The Edge of Democracy, which is a fantastic documentary about politics in Brazil back in April, and you can find it on our Abbey Research YouTube playlist. But this book goes into a lot of specifics about basically understanding what a country that a lot of us have heard of but don't really understand. And Brazil is such a complicated weaving of politics and geography and colonization and culture in a way that is, a lot of people compare it to the United States, but in a way that's also very, very different. And he does such a wonderful job of breaking down the big elements of Brazilian culture, but then how we can use that to help us understand Brazil as a global power. And in his introduction, he said, this is an important part that I wanted to make sure I made. He says, as in the United States, many things in Brazil tend to be big. Distances, truck stops, restaurants, and portion sizes, for example. Like Americans, Brazilians think nothing of driving for several days to get somewhere. The result is that the two largest countries in the Americas resemble each other, though often as if seen through a distorted mirror. That may be the reason why each is often frustrated and disappointed by the behavior of the other. And he goes on to say, in sum, Brazil is a world of its own, and Brazilians, like people from the United States, have a strong sense of exceptionalism. So, especially reading this as an American, it was so insightful to kind of get that lens of how Brazilians see themselves and how that vision has been shaped by the culture and the history and the politics and colonization, which is what we've talked about so much on Colonizers World Tour. And so for that, I think it's a really great book to give you that level of insight, and to be able to help us draw those connections so that we can understand Brazil a bit more and Brazilians a bit more, even though it is a very, very, very complicated place. And the last section that I wanted to make sure and get into this review is from almost the end of the book. where he's kind of wrapping up his arguments about Brazil as an idea. And he says, from colonial times until the dictatorship, which was the late 1960s, an abiding preoccupation of Brazil's leaders was to hold together a vast territory of difficult geography, where establishing communications and the conditions for prosperous and healthy human life was enormously difficult. As a result, in Brazil, it was the state that created the nation, rather than the nation creating the government or the state, as happened in the United States. So I thought that was such a great point to end this brief discussion on. And it goes back to that first quote that I read about Brazil kind of being the inverted mirror of the United States. We can't really compare a lot of aspects outside of geography and operation. Both countries were certainly extensive participants in the transatlantic slave trade, but Brazil's numbers of enslaved persons from Africa absolutely dwarfs the United States. They had over 40% of enslaved people, captured enslaved people, were enslaved in Brazil. So there's not a lot of direct comparisons, except in kind of the way that a country that is that large geographically and in terms of the number of people and groups of people and cultures that are believed to be unified under a national identity. But as we know as Americans, it's often much more complicated than that, and thus is the case for Brazil. But I learned so much, and I grew so much from the positioning of this book and the challenges that it forced me to consider in how I understand politics in the Americas, and my country's relationship to this country. So we recommend here from the good doctors at Abbey Research Reads, Michael Reid's Brazil, The Troubled Rise of a Global Power. And I hope I will see you again soon. Take care and happy reading.